state lawmaker is pushing the state to do more to address the issue of rising property taxes in the state of South Dakota.
State House reporter Grant Green with more on the proposal and those who will be involved.
Yeah, Brian and Andrea, Representative John Hanson is asking lawmakers to pass a resolution that would put together an interim committee which will take a deeper dive into the issue of property taxes, which everybody seems to be talking about. This committee would be made up of several lawmakers, the commissioner of the Bureau of Finance and Management, and either the governor or lieutenant governor or a designee of their choosing. Hanson's hope is that the committee will find a long-term solution. As he said in committee today, many of the bills running through the legislature in session are nice, but not enough.
Moving forward, I think we need to work together to really accomplish something significant in terms of lowering that burden, not just stop the bleeding, but ultimately lowering the burden.
He says this topic is one that is hurting everyone in the state.
You know, this issue really isn't just about one class of taxpayers. I've heard it from many elderly people in my district who, you know, are on fixed incomes and are facing significant hardship.
Governor Roden has fiercely backed his bill, which aims to cap growth in total taxable value of owner-occupied homes at 3% for the next 5 years.
We've received a few comments and made some edits. Specifically, we want to ensure that the taxing districts can capture growth as value is added. So some of that language has to be clarified.
Roden added that the bill has a grandfather clause for those enrolled in the Property Tax Assessment Freeze program. And today's House State Affairs Committee passed Hanson's resolution with a favorable 12-1 vote, the one dissenting vote coming from Representative Tim Reich, who wants to see that permanent fix come this year in the legislative session instead of waiting another year and having to do it all over next year. In Pierre, Grant Green, Dakota News Now.
Grant.